Not at all. At a certain time in my life, I became aware of that which doesn't change in myself. Very occasionally, this change in our identity happens suddenly. And as a result, we can say this change took place on the 24th of June, 2003. However, it's usually not like that. However, in most cases, this change can happen gradually and even without the mind noticing. Let me give you an example. Imagine you wake up in the morning with a headache and you drink a glass of water, you take some fresh air, you have an aspirin, and then go to work. You come home in the evening and you realize, oh, my headache has gone. But you cannot pinpoint the exact time at which your headache disappeared. So the belief and feeling that we are a temporary, finite consciousness located in the body is like a headache. It is the ultimate cause of suffering. And the recognition of our true nature is the disappearance of the headache, the disappearance of the root cause of suffering. Let me tell you a story about a famous Zen master called Shunryo Suzuki. Somebody asked him the question, why do you never speak of your enlightenment experience? And his wife, who was sitting at the back of the hall, stood up and said, because he never had one. In other words, the recognition of our true nature is not a particular experience. It is the revelation of our essential self. When I say our essential self, I mean that element of ourself that cannot be removed from us. Our thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions are continually appearing and disappearing and are therefore not essential to us. When all thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions have disappeared, what remains? Only that can be considered to be our essential self. So enlightenment, or the recognition of our true nature, is not a new experience that happens at a particular time, but is rather the revelation of what we always and already are, but which is, in most cases, obscured by thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. In fact, the recognition of our true nature is neither gradual nor sudden. The recognition of our true nature takes place in between two thoughts or perceptions. And between two thoughts, there is no time, and between two perceptions, there is no space. Therefore, the recognition of our true nature cannot be said to take place in time or space, and is therefore neither sudden nor gradual. I got it by exploring my essential self. When I was a 5-year-old boy, I called myself I. 20-year-old man, I called myself I. In other words, the word I refers to that element of myself that remains continuously present throughout all experience. Recognize my true nature by exploring what is meant by the word I. What I essentially am is that element of myself that remains continuously present throughout all states and experiences. No thought, sensation, or perception remains continuously present throughout all states and experience, therefore cannot qualify as what I essentially am. So let me ask you a question. What element of your experience of yourself remains continuously present throughout all states and experiences? Now, tell us more about that. How do you describe it? But what is perceiving? But what is the subject that perceives? It is prior to perception. Okay. Just like the screen is prior to the movie. In other words, your existence or your presence is prior to and independent of the fact of perceiving. And it's very easy to check this in your experience. In between two perceptions, you don't cease to be. For instance, in deep sleep, there is no perception, but nevertheless, you, consciousness, are present. But ask yourself the question, what am I between two perceptions? When the perception of that sound comes to an end, do you cease to exist? Yes, but when the sound stopped, the awareness that was aware of it didn't stop. It remained present. Awareness is not working. Awareness is simply present as the background of all experience. Consciousness is present all the time. Perception is present some of the time. Consciousness is that which knows or is aware of our experience, but it is not itself an experience. So let's start there, because this is where we agree. The subject of experience, consciousness, can never be an object of experience, like a thought or a perception. The screen never appears as an object in the movie. Okay. The screen is consciousness, the movie is experience. So the movie depends on the screen, but the screen doesn't depend on the movie. Okay. Experience depends on consciousness, but consciousness doesn't depend on experience. The screen is prior to the movie in the same way that consciousness is prior to experience, that is, prior to thought and perception. The time between the darkness and the light is the time between not knowing oneself and knowing oneself. How do we go from not knowing ourselves to knowing ourselves? By exploring ourselves. How do we explore ourselves? We go to the experience of ourselves. What am I really? If we want to explore ourselves, we have to go to the experience of ourselves. Qualifies for the name I or myself. To discover that is to move from the darkness to the light. I will tell you my story. When I was 17, I started reading Rumi's poetry. Shortly after that, I learnt mantra meditation in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. I studied and practiced the traditional Advaita Vedanta teachings for 20 years. During that time, I studied widely the non-dual teaching. Rumi, Hafiz, Irina Tweedy, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, Robert Adams, Darfree John, Meister Eckhart, Jacob Burma, the Desert Fathers, etc., etc. In my mid-30s, I met my teacher, Francis Lucille, to the direct path through Atmananda Krishna Menon, and the tantric path through Jean Klein. But more importantly, he introduced me to my true nature. Under his guidance, I recognized my true nature. Francis Lucille introduced me to the direct path through Atmananda Krishna Menon and the tantric path through Jean Klein. For the next several years, I spent with him assimilating the recognition of my true nature into my everyday experience. I then spent 13 years with Francis Lucille, during which time I assimilated this recognition into all aspects of my experience. Shortly after that, I wrote my first book, The Transparency of Things. And shortly after that, I began holding meetings and retreats. That's my story. There was the recognition of my true nature, and then there was the stabilization of that recognition in my life. And at a certain moment, I felt confident enough to begin to write about these matters. It happened by investigating what I essentially am. By asking myself the question, what element of my experience remains consistently present throughout all states, all knowledge, and all experience? Who am I really? All the beliefs and feelings about what that I previously took myself to be gradually faded. And at some point, when all these had faded, my true nature became evident. Just like when the fog gradually dissolves, the blue sky becomes evident. Now, we cannot say exactly when the blue sky became evident, because the sky is in fact always evident, even when it's foggy. But the fog seems to obscure the sky in the same way that thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions seem to obscure our true nature. So as thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions dissolve or fade, our true nature becomes evident. In my case, it would be very difficult to say exactly when this took place. To begin with, there were numerous glimpses of the blue sky. In time, those glimpses became longer and longer. And along with this, the ability of the fog to obscure the sky diminished. And at a certain time, the recognition of the sky became stable. But the glimpse of the blue sky is always the same glimpse. Somebody once asked Krishna Menon, what are the best conditions for spiritual practice? He said, the police force or the military. But the first glimpse that happened for me was after I heard the very first words that my teacher spoke. He said, meditation is a universal yes saying to everything. I had many partial glimpses before that, but that was my first glimpse of the clear blue sky. And there were many more after that, each one adding depth and conviction to that first glimpse. Each one adding depth, stability, and conviction. So there came a time when I felt stable in this understanding. Because something about my teacher's words drew my attention to the background of experience where previously it had been focused on the foreground. Something about my teacher's words drew my attention away from the fog to the blue sky. The person sitting next to me will also have heard the same words, but they won't necessarily have had the same effect. The words were just perfect for me in that moment. Well, consider the meaning of the words. What is it in us that says yes to every experience, however pleasant or unpleasant that experience may be? Let me give you another story. A few years later, my teacher was explaining that everything appears in consciousness. At that moment, a dog started barking on the other side of the valley. And I said to him, but the dog is obviously barking on the other side of the valley, a mile away. And he said, close your eyes and place your hands on the floor. I was sitting on the floor in front of him. So I closed my eyes and I put my hands on the floor like this. And then he asked me, where does that sensation take place? And at that moment, I recognized that the experience of the floor, which I previously believed was something that was outside of me, was in fact taking place inside. And with my eyes still closed, I listened again to the sound of the dog. And in that moment, I realized that the sound of the dog took place in the same place as the sensation of the floor. In other words, in consciousness. And at that moment, I realized that all experience takes place in consciousness. And I realized, in fact, that I had never had an experience of anything outside consciousness. All perception takes place in consciousness, yes. Perception takes place at this moment. I see your faces, I hear your voices, I touch my computer. So seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, all take place in consciousness. Imagine that you're watching a movie of a landscape. Where in the landscape does the screen take place? The screen doesn't take place in the landscape. The landscape takes place in the screen. So consciousness doesn't take place somewhere or anywhere. All somewheres or anywheres, in other words, all places take place in consciousness, but consciousness is in no place. In other words, consciousness is not in time or space. I experience in exactly the same way as you experience, but I have a different interpretation of my experience. So two people can be sitting next to each other. One person feels, I am in the world. The other person feels, the world is in me. The world appears to them in the same way. But for the first person, the world is something made out of matter, which exists outside of themselves. Second person, the world is something made out of consciousness that is inside themselves. So although the world appears in the same way to each person, the two people have very different interpretations of their experience, and therefore their relationship with the world is very different. It depends whether your interpretation comes from your experience or whether your interpretation comes from an idea that you have inherited from your culture, but not verified for yourself. For instance, most people believe that they experience the world outside of themselves, in spite of the fact that all anybody knows of the world is a series of perceptions, and all perceptions take place in consciousness. In this case, there is a contradiction between our beliefs and our experience. However, for the one who says the world appears in myself, there is no contradiction between this statement and his experience. The pain is a sensation in consciousness. The sight of your faces is a perception in consciousness. Let me ask you a question. Have either of you ever had an experience that took place outside consciousness? Nobody has ever had an experience outside consciousness. Very occasionally. But because one's true nature is the source of peace and happiness. If one knows one's true nature, one knows the peace and happiness that lives there. Because our true nature is pure happiness. Yes, it is obscured. Therefore, most people see the white fog, not the blue sky. The white fog is suffering, the blue sky is happiness. I am the blue sky. So are you. It's my experience, yes. Yes, most people's recognition of their true nature is obscured by thoughts and perceptions. It is true that everybody is the blue sky, but not everybody realizes it. Those that do realize it tend to be at peace. Those that don't aren't. I'm not experiencing my true nature. I am my true nature. I'm not experiencing consciousness. I am consciousness. It is self-evident. Sometimes there is fog in the sky. Sometimes there is rain in the sky. Sometimes there are thunderstorms in the sky, but I am always the sky. Because the consciousness that is aware of the garlic, or the consciousness that is aware of the apparent fire, is the same. So it is possible to mistake the garlic for the fire, but it is not possible to mistake consciousness. Whether you think you are experiencing garlic or fire, it is the same consciousness that experiences both. So there may be some doubt as to what you are experiencing, but there is no doubt that you are experiencing. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you. And I hope our conversation is helpful for your readers.